Recording. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm the host for today's episode. With me today is Mark DuVal, President and CEO of DuVal and Associates, and Kathy Herzog, who is the Senior Regulatory Quality and Compliance Associate at DuVal and Associates. How are you all doing today?
Good, Etienne. Thanks for having us.
Great to have you. Well, the reason I wanted to talk to you all today was the FDA, I believe it was back in November, they had a proposed rule for wound dressing. And I don't have the exact title in front of me, but the long and short of it was, well, I do have the title, Medical Devices, General and Plastic Surgery Devices, Classification of Certain Solid Wound Dressings Formulated as Gel, Creams or Ointment, and Liquid Wound Washes. It's a kind of a lengthy title for this proposed rule. But I wanted to bring you all on today just to talk about what this rule is so we can help the audience understand what is going on in this proposed rule. I wonder if you could start, Mark.
Yeah, and Kathy, don't hesitate to chime in. Kathy's, she's steeped in this as well, and she was part of filing our proposed comments that we filed anonymously on behalf of some clients. But the idea is a very broad one, and that is to use antimicrobial resistance and its effect on the microbiota as a raison d'etre for proposing a rule that is a very all-encompassing rule on wound products and wound gels. And this is a really well-characterized, well-known, and quiet area, frankly. And Kathy's an expert. She, as one of our biomedical engineers, she spends a ton of time with the agency on this, making submissions and making arguments why we should expedite clearance for these products. But they're trying essentially to accomplish two things. One is have a reason, I would call it a pretext, AMR as a pretext, or antimicrobial resistance as a pretext for regulating this category of products. And so two things are supposed to obtain. One is that for new products, there would be a new list of performance requirements, and I'd love Kathy to delve into that because she knows them cold. And it looks like it's an attempt to expand what they aren't. Usually when we get in and they ask for some of the things they're asking for here, we would challenge them, and usually successfully, and get them to not ask for what they want for the clearance of these devices, but ask what they need, and at least burdensome parlance, we would call that the minimum necessary amount of information. The second thing is for existing products. Basically, they want to start taking away some marketing claims, intended use claims that are already within the legal order that is what a 510(k) is. So they really legally can't take away those claims, but the regulation purports to do that. So that if you want to retain some of the claims you currently have, you'd have to go back to the FDA with additional data. And so it's pretty frustrating to us because, and I'd love for Kathy to talk not only about the performance requirements, but the administrative record, we believe, is really thin. Because when you propose a rule, there's got to be a reason behind it, right? As we discussed. And the FDA is hearkening back to a 2016, what was it? It was a
panel meeting.
Panel meeting. I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. It was a panel meeting that we attended and we spoke at, where they came up with a reason, and they were voted. The FDA was voted down at that point by 14-2 vote to not change or reclassify these products. And here we are, a few years later, with the same commissioner who was then the acting commissioner, revolving back in as the actual commissioner, and he continues with his onward march to try and get this class of products, wound dressings, reclassified. Don't entirely know the rationale for it. Sometimes I think it's just to generate a bunch of new studies for a lot of academic institutions and the FDA to review. But there hasn't been a lot of additional data between that intervening panel meeting in 2016 and the current time that would substantiate or undergird their request for reclassification. Kathy, do you want to elaborate on some of that? Because I know you're really familiar with the administrative record, or lack thereof.
Yeah, I mean, simply put, this is a class of dressings that has been on the market successfully and safely for 4 decades. And what FDA has been attempting to do over time is classify these unclassified pre-amendment wound dressings. But when you have 40 years of experience, that should be paramount in terms of determining what level of classification and if special controls are needed. And as Mark mentioned, the backbone or the primary genesis of this proposed rule is a belief, and in our opinion, that's an unsubstantiated belief, that these types of wound dressings that contain antimicrobials, and that's an important characterization of these products, they contain antimicrobials, and FDA is suggesting that the presence of these antimicrobials contribute to antimicrobial risk. So it's known that preservatives can have mechanisms of actions by which they produce or could produce antimicrobial resistance, but it's not a definitive clinical observation. There isn't a smoking gun here that says definitively this is a risk that would justify the proposed special controls related to AMR risk and effect of these wound dressings on the peri-wound microbiota. So these are a couple of the special controls that FDA is suggesting that are mostly problematic in the proposed rule and are confusing to industry how they would actually conduct performance testing to assure that these devices remain safe.
And I
No,
know, yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, Etienne, you go first.
Well, what I was going to say is I know this is still in a proposed state, and so the period of comments has passed by now. And I was actually looking at your client alert, which we'll put a link to in the show notes so that people can read that. 56 people objected, or 56 of the comments of the 74 comments were objections. Only 2 agreed with this. I'm really curious what the impact will be, and maybe before we get to the impact, but do you anticipate some of the ruling changed? I don't know if you have any insight into how the final may differ from the proposed, if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, we've got some really good connections within the agency on Capitol Hill and with the trade associations, and we happen to have some inside information. We know that, and this transcends just the wound dressing regulation. FDA is trying to rush through a whole bunch of things right now on laboratory developed tests and this proposed rule and a whole bunch of other things that look rather precipitous. And we know that they're trying to get through before the election. We've been told that by a number of people. And so we know that they're concerned about a change in administrations, whether that happens or not, that they might not have as favorable an environment for what they want to do. So that's one thing. And there are a lot of companies and there are a lot of trade associations that have gathered together that are trying to stop this proposed rule. It really, to them and to us, feels like a solution in search of a problem. The sky, is not falling. We recognize and appreciate that FDA has a bona fide concern for AMR and its collateral effect on the microbiota, but there's no objective or circumstantial evidence to support such a belief as it relates to wound products. And the additional testing proposed by the FDA, in our view, is not relevant, frankly, to the theoretical threat that antimicrobial wound products pose on AMR and the effect on the microbiota as a public health issue. In fact, they never called for taking any products off the market. If this is a true life scare, they should propose something like that, but they're not, because that'd be crazy, because wound products actually prevent the antimicrobial issue from getting larger than they are. Where they're not really addressing a lot of the products that are casually on the marketplace, like hand washes and solutions and things that you might see in schools and in large employers. And we see them here in the Skyway in downtown Minneapolis, and you can pump stuff in your hand. There's all sorts of places where these products exist, and those aren't even being addressed. Those are far more ubiquitous and used. And you tell a physician you're taking away an antimicrobial wound dressing from them, and they'd say that's malpractice. You can't do that. We might have surgical site infections. We might have all sorts of problems that could result in amputations. They could result in some serious infections and sepsis. So there's a far different view of this from the medical community than there is FDA. And again, that's why, you probably thought that was rather provocative. And then I said, they're trying to do is a pretext, but that's why we say that. There's really no medical record. If I might quote, Etienne, if you permit me,
Sure.
this is from the proposed rule. There's an adjunct to the proposed rule where FDA always has to do a preliminary regulatory impact analysis, and it's called an initial regulatory flexibility analysis. And this is from page 10 of that second regulatory document. And let me just read this. It's really a funny application of an economic theory called negative externalities, which is supposedly supposed to substantiate the reason for this rule. So it says this: the proposed rule addresses a source of market failure associated with the use of these products. The use of a wound dressing or liquid wound wash covered by this proposed rule potentially imposes a cost on society in the form of increased prevalence of AMR. Now, follow this logic. I almost had an economics minor when I came out of college, and I was one credit short of it, but I know what negative externalities are, and this is pretty funny. It goes on to say, because medical providers and their patients primarily focus on the private benefits and costs associated with the use of a wound dressing or wash, they fail to fully account for the contribution of their use of these products to AMR prevalence in society. This is known as a negative externality. That's in economic terms. It goes on to say, a consequence of a negative externality is that the wound dressings or liquid wound washes may be used too frequently, given that the private benefits and costs of their use do not incorporate the additional social costs of AMR. Federal regulatory action such as this proposed rule may help alleviate, it says may help alleviate, doesn't say will help, this market failure by limiting or changing the use of wound dressings and liquid wound washes containing antimicrobials. That is as ridiculous of a rationale as I have ever seen. And it's, well, I don't know. I love Kathy
Yeah.
to comment on.
Well, I go back to an opening comment. It's rare that you would have 40 years of history on a particular, wound dressing class here. And in the 2016 panel that Mark referenced, FDA had done an analysis of MDRs. So MDRs are medical device reports where a manufacturer or an end user can report alleged complaints where patient serious injury or death may have occurred. And so if you take a look at the amount of time these wound dressings have been on the market and the millions and millions of uses, there's a lot of exposure here. And at the 2016 panel, FDA had a slide presentation where they summarized that over 22 years that they looked back, there were 1,125 MDRs, but there were no deaths attributed to the dressings. There's no obvious link to AMR. And the most common reported problems are erythema, which is redness, infection, and blisters. But none of those would rise to the level of we need to really change our whole mindset on how this class of dressings is regulated.
That's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought that up. I love hearing the history about it, and I think I don't know if the pandemic and the prevalent use of, like you said, what's out there in the public now has changed some of the thoughts. Regardless of that, I'm really curious what your impact analysis or what your thought is on X number of companies, X number of products that could be impacted if this rule is finalized as is.
Oh boy.
Do you have
It's
any
got to be,
thoughts there?
what do you think, Kathy? Oh,
my worry is that there's such vagueness in the special controls that are proposed. For example, performance testing to characterize the AMR risk, or AMR risk assessment, performance testing for peri-wound microbiota influence, testing on delayed wound healing potential. It's so difficult in the context of how ubiquitous antimicrobials are present in the general world
Mhm.
that to conduct a study on the backs of a singular manufacturer and wound dressing for a global concern is not fair to the industry. It's too much to absorb. These should be government-led studies to tease out if these localized dressings are really contributing to AMR. So it's unsustainable that
Yeah.
Small wound dressing manufacturers would have to bear that burden on the back of an individual wound dressing.
What's
You know
been the,
that.
yeah, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No,
I'd
no, no,
rather
you.
have you go ahead. I've interrupted you twice. You go.
Well, I was just curious what the broader industry response has been to these proposed changes, or if they're aware. I mean, it sounds like it's going to be pretty heavy uh, if this goes
Yeah,
through.
so if the effect, let's talk about first existing products. If the effect is to deprive or take away claims that they currently have, there'll be litigation. The FDA is not allowed to use a regulatory framework like this to override a congressional statute that has created the 510(k) is a legal order, as I mentioned earlier. And you can't just say, okay, now we're going to tell you that you can no longer have the claims you've been legally granted under a statute by virtue of a subsidiary regulation that FDA has kind of created as a figment of its own regulatory imagination. They cannot do what they're doing, and I think there may be a class action where a lot of companies will sue the agency so that they're not deprived of the current labeling that they have. The second one is with respect to new products. We're going to reach back and look at the predicates as they always do, and they're entitled to rely under the statute as current legal orders that are already on the market, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of them, right? They're going to be able to cite something as a predicate, and FDA is going to say, no, you can't use it anymore, at least not with these claims. These are the new set of claims you're going to get, and these are the new performance tests you're going to have to conduct. And are those tests really commensurate with what the concerns are? And the concerns that they raise have to be substantiated concerns, not just theoretical concerns as they are today. Look, I'll give you an example. I went with a long time ago. I went with an orthopedic company that was trying to coat antibiotics on its orthopedic devices. And the FDA at that time said, this is back when Christy Foreman was still director of the Office of Device Evaluation. That tells you how long it goes back. And I remember she said, well, you guys need to do testing for antimicrobial resistance. And I'm like, whoa, time out, wait a minute. You're telling this small orthopedic company that they're going to have to do a study of societal magnitude that you haven't even asked the manufacturers of the antibiotics to conduct to demonstrate antimicrobial resistance. And furthermore, what orthopedic surgeon is going to put those kind of devices in a human body without slathering it with an antimicrobial or an antibiotic? Because that's just malpractice. And, I knew they were being pressured by CDER. A lot of this, I think, has its genesis from CDER, thinking because these are all combination products and they're putting the weight of their authority behind it. But CDRH is left to administer it. And I kind of feel sorry for them, frankly, because it's a problem that's looming. It's a problem that's on, like we called it, a runaway train. That's what we seem to have here. And so I close maybe, and I know I'm not closing the whole broadcast, but close with this part of the thought is, I've postulated this question. Why is it that FDA often feels the need to overregulate quiet, well-known, well-settled product categories? Is it fiefdom building? Like I said earlier, is it a scientific expedition without a destination? Is it a mindless escalation of data requirements? Is it regulatory boredom? Because the 510(k) program, who likes a quiet, well-managed 510(k)
Right.
category? Or is it all of the above? And I don't know what it is, but why do we get these things from time to time? And I think Commissioner Califf needs to do some splaining to industry about why is it that we're suffering through this, all of this in a quiet, well-established product category.
Well, and you mentioned the potential for a pretext, and you believe this is a pretext, and already stated about some of the people that some of the insiders who believe this is something they're trying to get done before the administration could potentially change. If this, if that does get through, or if it doesn't, I'm curious. Like the two different paths seem to be before us then, and I don't necessarily want you to ask you to speculate, but how do you see this changing from a bigger picture from the FDA? If the administration does change, if it doesn't change, do you have any thoughts on the potential from a bigger picture view with the
Well,
FDA?
I'm going to start and then let Kathy contribute because she does a lot of individual submissions. In fact, she's confronted with 2 products already where they seem to be carrying through some of the thinking in the regulation to individual product submissions. But I think broadly, the agency, if I'm concerned about the precedents being set. If the agency can use regulations to essentially go outside the scope of the statute that would allow them to create a subsidiary regulation, that's a bad precedent. This is well beyond their jurisdiction and authority in the arena of wound dressing products. And they're very cavalier about saying that they have authority. They're very cavalier about laboratory developed tests.
Right.
The agency is getting quite strident in a number of product and regulatory categories that in my profession, in the legal regulatory profession, we're becoming concerned with how bold and embracing they've become. So that's my overarching comment as it transcends the wound dressing products. Kathy, take us down into the granularity of submissions and what that could look like, and maybe what you're even starting to see with some current submissions before the regs even been finalized. You're on mute, Kathy.
Thank you. I've got allergies and I'm trying to spare you from my throat clearing. I think an area that has been confusing is you have these wound dressings that contain an antimicrobial as a product preservative, and they're treated as active drugs, as combination devices. And that is like a handcuff because it's an overregulation of use of an ingredient that is for product protection. It's not to have a clinical effect for wound management. So I think that has caused a lot of confusion where on the drug side, these same ingredients could be represented in like a human OTC drug as an inactive ingredient. But somehow on the CDRH side, in use in a FRO dressing, for example, they're viewed as an active ingredient. And so I think that there are a few wound dressings that do contain drugs, actual drugs that are recognized on the CDR side, like bacitracin, where an AMR risk is probably likely. But to take the 99% that contain antimicrobials at the level of a product preservative seems like such overkill and overregulation. And that's causing, I think, issues with moving products forward because it's like FDA is saying, if you don't have an antimicrobial that we currently have cleared, you're going to have to consider de novo or PMA to introduce those new drug components into an FRO dressing.
And what's worse,
and that's overkill.
Yeah, it is overkill. And what's worse, I would mention, Kathy, and one of the things that we've seen is that the preservative that was maybe not present in the FRO category that they like to, as if that's the substitute for the 510K program, because they've not seen it in the FRO product code. They say, well, you can't. So they've frozen the category, and you can't use any other preservatives going forward, even if those preservatives have been safely used in other arenas on the mucosal membranes. Think of vaginal or
and performance testing can be done to assure that they are safe and effective. And it's the same performance test that other preservatives would be subject to.
Wow.
Worried about innovation becoming stifled.
Yeah.
That we're kind of like, and I also worry if, when you look at the AMR risk, FDA in the proposed rule has categorized it into low, moderate, and high, medically important antimicrobials. But in the low category, that might actually influence industries to say, well, I'm just going to choose a low AMR product because it'll be easier to get it cleared. But in a way, that's kind of forcing industry into a certain bucket or a certain selection of preservatives, which is anti-innovation over time.
And that's not to say, Etienne, that we don't think FDA has a legitimate concern with some of the antibiotics and some of the more serious products that are being incorporated into a wound dressing that would require, a PMA. We're not disputing that there is a category of products that does require, a higher level of scrutiny, no question. But to use it in a broad sweep, is really problematic.
And well, that kind of leads me to the next question that I would have, and that is, if this goes through the way it is, what strategies do you think companies should be adopting moving forward to navigate this potential regulatory change? Any thoughts, or have you explored that yet?
Well, right now we've spent our efforts trying to stop the agency and get
Yeah,
them more reasonable in their thought process, and we will continue to do that. And we know that there are groups that are queuing up to sue them.
and
Um,
and,
it,
and I'll just say for my part that I am glad that there are people like you all out there who are concerned enough to write these comments and make these oppositions. So I'll just throw that
now,
out.
thank you. We alerted our clients to it right away, and we didn't know that they started getting really alarmed as they read the rule. But
Right.
beyond that, a lot of folks are going to Congress, whether Congress in a busy election year. I'm already making the prediction. Somebody has asked me in the past, when, well, is this going to be a year from now, or we really have to worry about it? I said, no, it'll happen in August, is my guess, because they'll do it when August recess from
Hmm.
Congress,
Yep.
and they'll try and hit when they're gone. And by the time, the rule gets finalized in the fall, everybody will be busy, swept up with the election, and it'll be of no consequence to anybody at that point, because it's a small item on the list of a much larger national agenda. So they are trying to get the attention of the Congress people right now. We'll see if that works. I'm just a little taken aback by FDA's just bordering on arrogance and imperialism. They've become not only they've moved from being just an administrative body to almost a quasi-legislative body. And that is a very concerning development. And a lot of regulatory lawyers in my field are talking about this at conferences amongst one another, and we're raising it in fora like this.
Yeah.
So we're sounding some alarm bells. The agency's taking a lot of liberties with this. When it gets frustrated with what Congress not giving it what it wants, it moves on its own.
Yeah.
It's like it's like a president signing a presidential order that's completely illegal, but they do it by virtue of the power of their position and not by the persuasiveness of their idea or following the process they're supposed to follow.
Right. Well, if I were to change that question then slightly, because I'm sure people listening that they want to be able, at least I feel more empowered when I have some thought on how I can move forward with this information that I've been given. If we don't really have a thought on, well, if we're not to the point where it makes sense to advise a company on how to move forward, assuming this is finalized, what about some advice on what they can be doing when they hear about this, particularly when it comes to FDA things? I know there are things like read the proposed rule, make those comments, and make those suggestions. Are there other avenues that you think people can or companies can be involved to make a positive change?
Well, if they're prepared to roll over, or think that it's inevitable and that a lawsuit is just going to be too time consuming and difficult, they can either continue to market in the face of FDA's opposition and raise, if FDA actually has the temerity, which they may not have, to, let's say they continue to make the claims, for example, they've always been making lawfully, and wait to see if FDA challenges them by virtue of a warning letter or even taking them to court, then they can defend themselves, and they have a pretty darn good solid defense. I think FDA will be afraid to do that because the first lost case will undo the entire, or at least that portion of the regulation. So that's one thing they could do, or they could decide, look, we're just going to do some additional studies and actually get those claims, because that might be profitable and charitable and useful legs in the marketplace anyway. So, there's some business decisions to be made. Do we
Right.
defend the status quo, or we decide that we'll move things along? I'm sure FDA is hoping that everybody kind of go along to get along, and the strength will be in the numbers of the industry. As everybody starts to follow it individually, it could break apart,
Yeah.
the alliance. So who knows what the future portends.
Kathy, I should have asked you this earlier, but I wanted to ask if you have a specific example, and you kind of gave one about what this could potentially look like in reality in the trenches in a regulatory submission. But do you have could you give me an example of this is how it's done prior to this proposed ruling, and if we were to do this afterwards, it would have this additional work. We've talked a little bit about the clinical data and so on, but can you kind of give an example or paint a picture there?
Yeah, I mean, so submissions after the rule is finalized, those devices would be subject to the special controls that are
Mm.
defined in the rule. And there's a set of special controls for class two, about class three. I think most of the products would still be in class two, so they'd be low to moderate AMR risk. But it is going to require new research and new information in the submissions than we provided before. So, for example, an AMR risk assessment, what does that look like? How would you document it? Is it literature based? What can you pull from prior clinical studies? Evaluating impact of the antimicrobial on wound healing. Is there any suggestion of delayed wound healing? So I think it's going to require quite a bit of research to figure that out. The third one being the impact of the wound dressing on local microbiota. So how does that impact wound healing? There's so many complicated factors that are interrelated here. What test houses would do this testing? How would it be done? Can it be done on the bench? Does it require a clinical study, an animal study? I worry about the time and cost that it would take to bring forward the data and what level of data FDA would really be looking for. I don't know if FDA plans to, if this were to be finalized as is, to create guidances to that effect to help industry navigate how they're going to respond to those special controls with additional data, but it is going to require a fair bit of research.
Kathy, I have a question
And
for you. If in the context of those special controls, if they do require some demonstration that there's, I don't know, a low level effect on AMR or no effect on AMR, antimicrobial resistance, how does industry yet have any clue as to how they would go about that, demonstrating that?
I haven't heard anyone come up with a proposal yet. I think we're all in the dark on that. It's not clear definitively how you would establish that. It's not established in the literature now. So if you were to research current literature, there's no smoking gun that says, at least for the low and moderate antimicrobials, that there is a definitive link to AMR risk. And
Yeah.
like you said earlier, Mark, conversely, you could also look at the research whether or not use of these localized wound dressings might contribute to the reduction of systemic antibiotics, which do have a more definitive risk to AMR. So it's not just research proving, are you in or are you out? It's looking at the whole picture and understanding the benefit of these dressings when used in treating wounds in general.
It seems to me too that a study of that size is almost epidemiological in nature. And that's why I said earlier, it almost has to be an NIH study or something
Right.
funded by the federal government. It can't fall on the shoulders of small companies. And if you ask them to do it, they're really not going to do it justice. They're not really going to establish it one way or another. It's going to
I
be
think
too
I think
small.
it would be paper based at that point,
Okay.
and then slowly it would be arbitrated through FDA as to where that evidence bar is going to fall.
Yeah.
But I can see some delay on review times while both parties are negotiating where that evidence level needs to be. And I agree with you. There's so many complicating factors that could influence the results. And my worry is that, excuse me, the smaller manufacturers can absorb that cost and time. And could the market shrink to just the big players that can afford to do so?
Right. And I would add to that, Kathy, this is not like a pharmaceutical product where the margins are enormous. I used to be general counsel for 15 years of a pharmaceutical company. I know how healthy they are. A wound dressing they have low margins and they're because it's a price volume trade-off. And so they can't possibly do that. I want to mention one thing, Etienne, that I forgot to
Please.
mention at the very beginning. And the reason, the technical legal reason FDA is going about for this entire uh, uh, game that we're playing for I shouldn't call it reclassification, for classification is they say, hey, 40 years ago, these were really never classified. Well, that's true. But that's why we are calling it a de facto classification in the sense that for 40 years, they've been clearing devices and they've de facto created the standards that are already there. We all know what's required for these devices. We all know the labeling we're supposed to get or not get. We all know the studies that have to be done or not done. And so it's kind of a regulatory fiction on their part to say, oh, now we need to engage in classification. That's why I say it's a pretext. It's really AMR is a cover for getting stuff that Kathy and I would fight them on an individual submission, and usually they'd acquiesce that, oh, you might not have to provide that additional data. When you can get common sense applied by the usually the review staff, if not middle management or upper management, as to what you need for an individual file. But they've been asking for extraneous stuff for a while now, and I think this is an opportunity for them to do it on sort of a wholesale basis, as opposed to fighting us on each individual submission as they do today. So I don't like that. That's the way the FDA is kind of it's a bit nefarious. And this commissioner asked for it when he was acting commissioner back then, but he went back to his job at Duke, where his very job was to get NIH and government grants and clinical trial funds from industry. So you wonder if there's an appetite to making sure that the academic community and the folks out there get a new corpus upon which to feed and having clinical trials, to be paid for. But it's unnecessary in this particular product category, unless they're really serious, like antibiotics or drugs being impregnated onto a wound dressing.
You kind of used LDTs as kind of a parallel situation that's occurring. Do you anticipate any additional proposed rulings coming down the pike that are kind of similar in nature?
Well, as you know, the government's, the FDA has been sued on they tried to get the VALID Act passed. They were unable to do it.
Multiple
And
times, yeah.
they were very public about it. Because Congress is unwilling to act, we're going to act. And they were very presumptive about their position. And it's been a position that has been fought for decades and decades. And they just finally decided we're going to be pretty strident about our position. And what Congress failed to give us, we're going to take for ourselves through regulation. And here we are. So they're being sued. So, people are upset when FDA thinks it can become a if not quasi-legislative, if not legislative body.
Yeah.
And Dr. Shuren knows better. He's got behind his name an MD and a JD. So he's both a doctor and a lawyer. And I think he should know the limitations of his role and that of the agency. But they're moving in some pretty aggressive fashions right now, and on a wide variety of fronts. I'm blanking out now, but I could probably list 8 of them for you that have just astounded us. But they're taking advantage of the fact that I think they think in the fall, the administrations are going to change, and they're not going to be able to take the liberties they're taking today.
Well, I really appreciate this information. This is really valuable. I think this is something people need to know more about. Where can other people, if they're interested, learn more about this? I know you have your client alerts. We'll put that in the show notes, but any additional ways they can see what kind of information you all put out?
Yeah, we put out a number of client alerts on this. I think if you really want to drill down and understand we wrote probably the second longest proposed comments to the proposed rule, and I think they're very thorough, and I think they're written in an understandable fashion. Other than that, I think you're going to see stuff coming out from the Washington Legal Foundation.
Okay.
You're going to see stuff coming out from the Alliance of Wound Care Stakeholders. There's a lot of groups that are medical providers, as well as a consortium of manufacturers that are very concerned about this. And I think you're going to see lots of additional stuff coming out. But we, for one, thank you for allowing us to keep the drumbeat going, because we're very concerned about where the agency is headed on this. And they know that we've told them that internally as a law firm to them, as our friends in the regulatory field. And we encounter these issues even in the context, as Kathy was talking about, individual submissions, and we know we're going to see that ratchet up more and more. FDA always tends to get ahead of their own proposals, and they solidify and finalize them when it comes in the context of an individual submission, even though that guidance or regulation is not yet finalized.
Yeah. Well, very, very, very cool. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I appreciate you sharing all of this. We'll put links in the show notes to all the different groups that you mentioned, so that people can dig down a little bit deeper if they like. we'll put links to your website as well, so people can find that as well. Thank you so much, Mark and Kathy. I appreciate the work you're doing, and hope to see you all next time. Take care.
Take care, Etienne. Bye.